Hello, I'm Kasia Madeira. This is the Iran War Today, our daily briefing, bringing you up to date with all you need to know on day 67 of the US-Israel war with Iran. So let's start with some of the key developments today. The US Defence Secretary says Washington is not looking for a fight with Iran. Despite exchanges of fire on Monday, he said the ceasefire remains intact.
We're not looking for a fight. But Iran also cannot be allowed to block innocent countries and their goods from an international waterway.
President Trump says he's making deals with South Korea and Japan on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Both countries rely heavily on oil from the strait, and yesterday a South Korean ship was hit by an explosion and caught fire. Iran's foreign minister says the exchange of fire in the Strait of Hormuz shows there's no military solution to what he called a political crisis. Pakistan says it continues to exchange messages between Tehran and Washington, but still no sign of any diplomatic talks on the horizon. The month-long ceasefire is looking dangerously fragile. After fending off Iranian missiles and drones on Monday, the UAE says its air defences have been activated again for a second day in a row. And almost 3 weeks into a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, the UN Security Council has met to discuss the ongoing fighting. The ceasefire is not over, claims Pete Hegseth, a day after the US exchanged fire with Iranian ships in the Strait of Hormuz. While the US Defence Secretary said the US is not looking for a fight, but warned Iran that any attempt to disrupt Project Freedom would be met with overwhelming US firepower. Secretary Hegseth said Project Freedom was a temporary measure to show allies that it's possible to guide ships through the strait.
This is a temporary mission for us. As I've said before, the world needs this waterway a lot more than we do. We're stabilizing the situation so commerce can flow again, but we expect the world to step up. At the appropriate time and soon, we will hand responsibility back to you.
Well, we've also heard from President Donald Trump, who said that the US has shown the world it is winning the conflict with Iran.
Iran has no chance. They never did. They know it. They express it to me when I talk to them. Then they get on television. They say how well they're doing. And they have no Navy, totally wiped out. They have no Air Force, totally wiped out. They have no anti-aircraft capability, totally wiped out. No radar. They have no leaders. The leaders are wiped out, the whole thing. And then I read the papers and they say how well they're doing. They're not doing well. That's why you have no credibility.
Well, let's cross over live to Washington to speak to our US State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. Tom, what is going on? Because the US says that ceasefire is still holding, but evidently there are strikes being made. Where are we?
Well, on the first point about the administration saying the ceasefire remains intact, I mean, they're adamantly going to say that because of this issue they've had with Congress, whereby all Democrats and even some Republicans are feeling pretty uneasy now about the fact that from the start of this war on the 28th of February, we're now well past the legal limit of 60 days, before which a US president is supposed to come to Congress to ask for authorization to continue military operations. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. That is because the administration argues that the clock stopped when the ceasefire came into effect on the 7th of April. So, you know, that is another motivation for Mr. Hegseth and others to keep saying that, no, the ceasefire remains intact, despite the fact you're seeing exchanges of fire between the US and Iran, and reports again in the last few hours of air defences activated in the United Arab Emirates. So clearly the situation there remains pretty bad. In terms of the actual military operation in the Strait of Hormuz, this is the US trying to reopen it by force. And I think the coming days will be absolutely decisive, because you've got now the Pentagon saying there are hundreds of ships lining up to come through. You've got the Iranians saying, no, we remain in control of the Strait of Hormuz, continuing to fire to harass and intimidate shipping. So whether or not you start to see movement en masse through that waterway is absolutely critical to the Trump administration's intentions here.
Indeed. Tom, thank you so much. Tom Bateman there, our US State Department correspondent. Well, fire at Fujairah port in the UAE on the evening of the 4th of May. There have been claims and counterclaims from the US and Iran over what has been happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Ben Chu from BBC Verify has been looking into what's actually been going on in the last few days.
There have been many conflicting claims about what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz in recent days. Here's what we know and also don't yet know. On Sunday, Donald Trump said the US Navy would guide ships safely out of these restricted waterways and that this would be called Project Freedom. Now, the United States claims 2 US warships and 2 US flagged commercial ships have safely passed through the Strait of Hormuz as part of this operation. And the shipping line Maersk has said that one of its ships, the Alliance Fairfax, a vehicles carrier, was one of them. Now, we can't verify that. The marine traffic tracking data, which is based on ships' radio transponder signals, shows the Alliance Fairfax here, still within the Gulf. But it hasn't been updated since the 1st of March. So the vessel must have turned its transponder off or gone dark, something we know many ships have been doing since this conflict began. And there is still danger in the Strait. UK Maritime Trade Operations has received 3 reports of incidents in these locations around the Strait on Sunday and Monday. A South Korean shipping line has said one of its vessels, a general cargo ship called the HMM Namu, experienced an explosion on Monday while at anchor. And you can see its position today here, though it's not clear at this stage whether it was caused by a drone or missile attack or by a drifting sea mine. The Abu Dhabi state oil firm has said that one of its empty crude oil tankers, the Baraka, was struck by Iranian drones. The Baraka's last transmitted position was here, but on the 24th of April, implying that it too has gone dark. Iran also claims to have fired on US shipping. That has been supported by a Monday briefing by US CENTCOM, but the US denies that these strikes hit their intended targets. Again, we're not able to verify this or the claim from Donald Trump that the US military has destroyed 7 Iranian military small fast boats, which Iran has counterclaimed were in fact civilian boats. But another point about ship tracking. This shows ship tracking movements in and around the Strait of Hormuz yesterday. And analysts say this glitchy pattern of shipping movements and clustering here indicates not actual ship movements, but likely defensive local global positioning system jamming by someone, possibly the United Arab Emirates, to make it more difficult for GPS-guided Iranian drones or missiles to find their targets. So if that's what this is, these defensive operations are making it even harder than usual to monitor shipping movements through the Strait. Finally, it's important to bear in mind that there are also threats to targets on land as well as at sea. United Arab Emirates has reported defending itself against Iranian drone strikes, and this is footage that we verified of a fire at a vital UAE refinery on Monday.
A ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon has been in place for almost 3 weeks, but it appears to be a ceasefire in name alone, with fighting continuing in southern Lebanon. Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon have killed 110 people since Thursday. Israel says 17 of its soldiers have been killed in the same period in ground clashes with the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah. Well, to address the ongoing fighting, the UN Security Council held a special meeting today in New York. Well, let's cross over to our Middle East correspondent, Wira Davis, who joins us from Jerusalem. And Wira, with so many people dead in southern Lebanon, this is a ceasefire in all but name.
Yeah, as you say, there is meant to be, and there's meant to have been for the last 3 weeks, a ceasefire in southern Lebanon between Israel and Lebanon. But of course, Hezbollah is not party to that ceasefire, and that is part of the reality, part of the problem. And we've been hearing in detail today from the Israeli Defence Forces, the Israeli military, about their military operations over the last few days in particular, during which, of course, this ceasefire is meant to have been in place. The Israelis said they've been targeting Hezbollah positions, rocket launchers, and in particular, what the Israeli Israelis are describing as tunnel networks inside Lebanese territory across the border around this exclusion zones the Israelis have imposed. What we haven't heard from the Israelis, but we know from the Lebanese side, is that well over 100 people have been killed since this increasing Israeli military offensive last Thursday. Israel, as you said, has lost fighters of its own. Hezbollah has been targeting, in particular, occupying Israeli soldiers inside southern Lebanon. But it's those villages and towns outside the exclusion zone that have been hit particularly badly over recent days. And the concern is, of course, that if this ceasefire doesn't hold, and that is dependent also on the situation over in Iran, the American-Iranian ceasefire. If the whole thing collapses there, then inevitably the ceasefire agreement between the Lebanese government and Israel will also probably collapse, and we'll see a big resumption in the Israeli military offensive in Lebanon. It will expand certainly beyond southern Lebanon, perhaps again to bombing parts of Beirut and other towns and cities across Lebanon itself. So great hope, but not much, great concern, but not much hope in Lebanon that the ceasefire will hold.
Rory Davis in Jerusalem, thank you. So, with fighting growing in the south of Lebanon, the US and Iranian ships exchanging fire in the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran firing missiles and drones towards the UAE, where do things stand? Well, I'm pleased to say we're joined by our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. Let's start with the ceasefire that the United States insists is a ceasefire with Iran. They have to say that, otherwise they need Congress's approval.
Yes, and also they do. I think it's clear they don't want to go back to war. They've got elections coming. The war is really unpopular in the United States. Some polls apparently have been saying it's even more unpopular than things were at the height of the Vietnam War. It was that bad in terms of the way that people are perceiving it. So no, it was very interesting, despite the fact that the ceasefire, the ceasefire is 4 weeks old and it's showing its age. How do ceasefires start looking frayed around the edges, or even worse than that? It's basically when, in this case, there is no diplomatic process backing it up right now. They had those negotiations a week or two ago back in Pakistan. They seemed, for a little while, to be going somewhere, perhaps. They got together, they even spoke in the same room. But in the end, the two sides have both got their red lines and they're not prepared to give them up. And that means that there is to make a deal, you have to be prepared to give a few things up to get to common ground. Neither side is prepared to do that. The Americans believe that the economic pressure they're putting on Iran will, in the end, cause the regime to, if not crumble, certainly do as it's told. I think that's really unlikely. Equally, the Iranians believe they can outlast the Americans, and the danger with all of that is that they get a little bit, they feel they overplay their hand, and they haven't yet shown how they can translate this leverage they've developed in the Strait of Hormuz, stopping 20% of the world's oil and gas and other important stuff getting out. They haven't shown how they translate that into a change, an agreed change in the status quo that benefits Iran, which is what they say they want to do. They say, the foreign minister has said there's no going back to the way it was when, before the war started, 28th of February, when the Americans and the Israelis attacked them. He said there's no going back to the way it was then.
And Jeremy, what is happening when it comes to the UAE? Because the Emiratis are saying that they've had strikes. The Iranians are saying that actually we don't want to target the Emiratis. So what is happening there? Because the UAE are saying that their kids are now being remotely schooled.
Yeah, I think they are really alarmed. From what I've been getting from well-placed Emirati sources, is they are definitely very alarmed by the way things are going. Publicly, their senior diplomats have put announcements on social media using very robust language, saying that they're not going to, that this should not be happening, and quite pushing back against Iran. What the UAE has been doing is doubling down on its relationship with the US and with Israel. It is the closest Arab country in terms of friendship to Israel. Naftali Bennett, a right-wing Israeli prime ministerial hopeful in the forthcoming elections, he, in social media post the other day, spoke of the UAE as Israel's strategic ally. Now, Iran sees, if Iran accepts that UAE may well be a strategic ally of Israel, And that makes them, in the eyes of, I think, the Iranian regime, even more of a target, potentially. The attack the other day was in Fujairah. And that's interesting too, because Fujairah is the little part, if you look at the map, of the coastline of the UAE that isn't on the Gulf. It's the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, facing down into the Gulf of Oman. So there's an oil pipeline that comes there. There's big oil storage facilities. Seeing pictures of that fire at the moment. They're big oil storage facilities, and they have actually been getting part of their usual oil exports out through that port. And so, you know, this is a message coming from the Iranians that if the war does start again big time, then they'll be hitting those sites which will hurt, not least the UAE.
So, Jeremy, what's your assessment? It feels like the opportunities for any kind of diplomacy are unravelling right now.
Well, if both sides stick to where they are, to their positions, they're not going to make a deal. Iran has said it doesn't want just a sort of temporary ad hoc ceasefire, because previously that's resulted in Israel and America attacking them again. The Americans, I think Trump would like to get some kind of a deal which he can wave around and call a victory, especially with these elections coming in the autumn, in November, I believe, in the United States. But I think that's unlikely. So I think the most likely outcome is this continuing risky situation of a ragged-looking, increasingly ragged-looking ceasefire, and it will continue to get ragged as both countries try and put pressure on each other to try to gain some advantage over the other. And this is the territory where misperceptions and miscalculations occur. So that could mean that at any time, any given time, they're one serious incident away from a resumption of all-out war. It is that unstable.
On that note, dangerous territory. Jeremy, thank you so much. Our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. Thank you. What a note to end this sequence. But whether you're joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio, or even television, thank you for your time. We're going to be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.